Right, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Sareen, and I have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the afternoon, Professor Jack Halberstam. Jack, do you want to come up? Jack is Professor of American Studies, Ethnicity, Gender Studies, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California, and as you probably know, is a prominent figure in queer studies that we've probably all been reading here for quite a while. Indeed, I have. Jack is the author of 5 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror, and The Technology of Monsters, which came out in '95, if I'm not mistaken, and then Female Masculinity, which had a huge impact on people studying queer theory, In a Queer Time and Space, which is kind of implicitly or explicitly in the title of our talk today, and my personal favourite, because it relates to my love life in particular, The Queer Art of Failure. She also came up with a beautiful book called Gaga Feminism, which kind of reached out of the spheres of academia and is currently working on another book project titled Wild Thing, developing Deleuzian ideas of becoming in relation to pharaoh narratives and zombies, a chapter on zombies. So those of you who were at the talk yesterday night could even think about the collusion between zombies and the queer art of failure. Her talk today is therefore titled Queer Times, Queer Spaces and Transgender Lives 10 years later, and we'll be interested in the idea of transgenderism, not so much as a collective identity, but more as an idea of passing, invisibility, visibility, and therefore please join me in welcoming Jack Halberstam.
Thank you, Anas, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you all for coming on such a gorgeous day. We won't stay inside too long, but just long enough to think together about this new moment of representational visibility for the transgender body. And I was thinking about this in relationship to a book that I wrote 10 years ago called In a Queer Time and Place, that tried to make sense of a sort of glimmer of visibility for transgender bodies in the middle of the 1990s. And the conditions of visibility were really, really different then, and the understanding of transgenderism was of a completely different order. So, you know, what happens when transgenderism goes from being a highly spectacularized, fetishized, almost invisible subculture to being, you know, in the media, becoming the subject of a Time magazine cover telling us that we have reached the transgender tipping point. So it's basically a really good moment to think about what this means in the context of neoliberalism, in relationship to the struggles for social justice that have focused upon sexuality and gender, and generally speaking in terms of the classifications that we've inherited in terms of our understanding of the gendered and sexual body. So what I want to do is sort of track back through the last 10 years of representation of transgenderism and see what it has to tell us about politics and the representation of minoritarian bodies now. So that's what we're sort of going to do. It's, you know, it's almost scary to have transgender characters on the cover of Time magazine, really. And on the one hand, for some people, it represents the apex of acceptance and recognition, but for others, it means the transformation of a marginal and potentially politically resistant position into another niche within a neoliberal market. And those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. Is this transgender tipping point just marking a new way of accessorizing the body, a new understanding of the gendered body as a place for surgeries, accessorizing, turning gender into a set of cosmetic options, right? Turning gender and transgenderism into some representational strategies that just enhance a TV market? Or is there some real possibility for thinking about liberation embedded in this moment of the tipping point? And along the way, I'll also try to draw attention to the question of temporality. What understanding of temporality does the transgender body mark and embody? So the book that I wrote back in 2005, In a Queer Time and Space, argued against an understanding of LGBT identities as simply sexual orientations or a particular understanding of one's gendered identity, and instead I argued that queerness must be understood as a particular relationship to time and space. And lots of people have written since then about queer temporality, but my book was one of maybe the first books to try to think about what it would mean to classify and define queerness as a relationship to time and space. And I'll give you some sense of what I meant by that. So, in terms of an understanding of queerness as a relationship to temporality, I proposed that one of the really amazing political potentials of queerness was the way in which it was a position from which to imagine life otherwise. So, from the perspective of being a young heterosexual person, life has a kind of regularity and a predictability to it, right? You're presumed to be heterosexual. Marriage is marketed to you from your adolescent years on, and with marriage is supposed to come some kind of reproductive normativity, followed by child rearing, retirement, death, and so on, right? So what I suggested was that queerness proposed a very different, unregulated, unpredictable relationship to the life narrative. If you can't simply think about yourself in relationship to this narrative of the marital system, what other kinds of systems might you cultivate? And here I propose that people would start thinking in terms of friendship and community instead of the couple and the marriage, and that this could have huge implications for the way in which we think about community and identity. I also proposed that thinking about queerness in terms of time and space puts more emphasis on subcultural involvement, such that queer people remain involved in subcultures for large parts of their life, not only when they're young and waiting for their marriage years to arrive, right? That's how we tend to talk about subcultures. For queer people, subcultures are a way of life, and it doesn't end when you're 21. You continue to participate in these subcultures for much, much longer. And then finally, of course, we began thinking in the early 2000s about queerness as a set of practices rather than a simply solidified identity that is inscribed into the body. So with those understandings of queerness in place, let's think then about how it was that transgenderism was represented prior to the contemporary period. And it's actually a very interesting arc. Looking back and seeing how the transgender body has emerged within cinema over, say, the last 50 years. And of course, if you even just look at photographs from the 1930s, you can see in these Brassai pictures of when Brassai went off into Paris by night with a camera, he understood photography to be going into out-of-the-way spaces and taking pictures of weird queer people who he proposed were, sort of sad and lost and needed to be recuperated in some way. But as we moved into the 60s and 70s, transgenderism became the face of horror and violence. So many films featuring transgender people continue to cast transgenderism as a kind of aberration, and this is a still from Dress to Kill, you might recognize it, and saw transgenderism as in need of explanation or as a symbol for sort of illegible social identities. So what I thought that I would do to push back on that reading of the transgender character as a metaphor for social rupture, as a thing that must be killed, and as the thing that comes to the society with a knife, ready to kill you, right? If only, we could say. Let's think about 3 different movies from the 1990s where transgenderism was represented in 3 different ways. So I want to give you those models to begin with. Does anyone remember this film, The Crying Game? No? How many people have seen The Crying Game? Wow. Okay. Okay, interesting. So, The Crying Game was such a big deal when it came out. I mean, that's just sort of the first thing to say about it. It came out in 1992. It was made by Neil Jordan, and it was marketed as a film that contained a secret. And the secret was something that you were asked, and since very few people have seen it, probably not very many people who saw it when it came out in 1992, it's important to actually remember this, that when it came out in 1992, you were told to go see the film, but not tell other people what you had seen. Because to do that would be to ruin the revelation that happens halfway through the movie, where the female protagonist is revealed to have a male body. Okay? This was a secret that the movie held. And this was, so of course, the transgender body is still being represented as this sort of sensationalist site of secrecy, mystery, and impossibility. But there was something that the movie did, that the film did, that Neil Jordan did in this film, that was very important. It moved away from simply seeing the transgender character as a sort of horrific figure where something had gone wrong, right, as in Dressed to Kill. A figure that was so troubled and damaged that it was going to set about wreaking violence on all of society. And instead, the transgender character became a deeply sympathetic character with whom the audience was asked to identify, okay? So this is the first film, we might say, where this actually happens, where there's a sympathetic relationship to the trans character. More than that, though, transgenderism was not the plot of the film, right? Any other film where transgenderism appears, that was what the film was about. But in The Crying Game was about a tension between political identities and bodily identities. And so it's a film about where a black British soldier meets and is captured by a gang of IRA activists when on duty in Northern Ireland. So the contradiction there is that he's a black soldier in a very racist Britain, but he is fighting on behalf of the British occupation of Northern Ireland. And then the Northern Irish guy becomes very sympathetic to the black soldier. And after the black soldier dies, he goes back to England to tell his wife that he is dead. And his wife ends up being Dill, whom the white IRA activist now falls in love with, not knowing that Dill has a female body. So that's how the narrative unfolds, but it isn't all about Dill. It's about these contradictions between who we are and the political positions that we hold, right? So that a black soldier would fight for Britain in Northern Ireland is a contradiction around this colonial occupation by a racist nation of Irish people with whom the black soldier should be in sympathy, right? And then the IRA guy who subscribes to a very normative understanding of identity falls in love with the transgender partner of the black soldier that he has killed, or he has participated in killing. So the whole film is a set of these contradictions within which transgenderism is just one side of contradiction. Now if you go back to Dressed to Kill, the transgender character is the site of contradiction. She embodies contradiction. She is social identity gone wrong that is so disturbed and pathological that she now has to try to kill everyone around her because she herself is wrong, right? So that's the phobic narrative about transgenderism. This is a less phobic narrative because it suggests that the whole social order is set up around and along the lines of deeply contradictory relationships between who you are and what you believe in. And we all can think of examples of people whose political beliefs are at odds with who they are. Like in the US, very, very poor people may well turn out to vote for Donald Trump, right? Even though Donald Trump is rapacious capital embodied. And he's the reason that they are poor. He is rich because they are poor, but they will show up to vote for him. So I think the Crying Game was a much more interesting template for thinking about transgenderism as a metaphor, not for the pathology of the transgender body, not for what can go wrong in gendered identity, but for the very complicated relationships between gender, sexuality, and the political, and the way in which they're very twisted ways in which who we are and what we believe in do or do not connect. And there's a great moment in the film where we get a sense of that, where Dill, and you see it in this image, Dill is lip-syncing to a song, The Crying Game. And that lip-syncing, the fact that she is singing without the voice being hers, is a metaphor for the way in which ideology moves through the body, right? Without it being your words, we all lip sync to the ideological systems that we're embedded in. So none of us are sort of just pure agents, as the film tells us. All of us are vectors for various forms of power that speak through us. And Dill is just one site for that kind of enunciation. Okay, so that was one film, 1992, very, very early on. Especially if you think about the fact that until the 1960s, it was actually forbidden to show minority, gendered, and sexual figures in Hollywood cinema because of the Hays Code. People know about the Hays Code, right? The Hays Code was a very, very strict code of representation that was imposed upon Hollywood in the 1930s when censors felt that they didn't know in these early days of cinema how audiences might receive controversial images. And there was good reason, in fact, in many ways, to be concerned. After all, new modes of mass media contributed in huge ways to the rise of fascism in Europe, the amplification of the voice, for example, the fact that one leader could speak to thousands of people because of amplification, whether through a microphone or through the radio, did, in many ways, contribute to the possibility of totalitarianism. So in the 1930s, in the US, there was a sense that people really didn't know how cinema would impact social movements at a very, very unstable time. And so these codes were put in place to try to legislate what kinds of images could circulate. Within that code, you could not show homosexuality, and you certainly couldn't show images of transgenderism with any level of approval. And that lasted all the way into the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, what happened was you had a whole set of representations that needed to counteract this censorship from the previous decades, and so produced, you know, mountains of positive images, as they were called at the time, which resulted in, like, really terrible cinema, by the way. I prefer the horror cinema was better in some ways than this slew of positive images that were designed to try to reclaim the power, or the humanity, if you like, of queer people. So the Crying Game broke with that tradition, and it presented us with a complex reading of a transgender character as just one side of social complexity among many. Okay? The film that really changed, in many ways, changed visually, politically, and in terms of representational style, how we understood the trans body, was Boys Don't Cry, made by first-time director Kimberly Peirce. Kimberly Peirce was, at that time, just a young lesbian filmmaker who circulated a version of this film in gay and lesbian film festivals and raised money to make a larger budget version of a story about a transgender man, Brandon Teena, and this was a true story, who had been killed by thugs, by violently phobic boys in Nebraska in the mid-1990s. And this was a case that had tremendous visibility in the US, and became one of the original starting points of transgender rights movements. So what had happened was Brandon Teena was a young 18-year-old person who understood himself to be male, even though he had a female body, and he presented himself as male in these small towns in Nebraska where he lived, and was accepted as male partly because in these rural areas there was no conception of gender fluidity. So if you say you're male and you look male, no one is questioning whether you are male. He dated a local woman, and when some of the men in town found out that there were rumors that he was female, they found him, they exposed him, they raped him, and they murdered him. And it was a very spectacular case, and when the case went to trial, there was a possibility that the men were going to get off on manslaughter charges, a very reduced sentence, because the argument was that they were so panicked by finding themselves in relationship to this horrifyingly transgendered body that their violence was uncontrollable. And if you believe it or not, this is a reasonable legal defense in the 1990s in the US, that somebody can be so panicked by being confronted with a queer body that they might erupt into violence. And transgender people turned up at the trial in huge numbers, and the men finally did receive long life sentences for murder. So this was a big deal story. It made visible trans masculinity at a time when people were only used to thinking about transgenderism as a phenomenon of male to female transition, the most visible being Christine Jorgensen, or the film that came out this year, The Danish Girl, about a Danish man who transitioned to become a woman. I think it was a dreadful film, actually, and it really just represented transgenderism as this passage from male to female, which, as we know from these films, it is not at all simply a movement from A to B, but is in this Deleuzian sense of becoming that doesn't stop. There is no destination. There is more of an understanding of gender as a set of processes that the body goes through. Boys Don't Cry was amazing because it gave us a visual language for understanding the transgender body. And I'll just give you an example of that visual language. So there's a really horrific scene in the film where Brandon Teena is to be exposed by the men who are eventually going to murder him. And they want to expose him, not to verify that he is a woman, but to show the woman that he's dating that he has a female body. So it's a triangulated structure of normativity, if you see what I'm saying. It's not just the boys saying, we know you have a female body, we want to see it. It's saying to the woman who knows that this person has a female body, but loves them nonetheless, okay? The boys are saying to the woman, right? This is that triangular structure of normativity. Look, he has a female body. So you must not desire this body. It's not saying we're appalled by the body, you must be appalled. And so it's a combination of transphobia and sexism, misogyny, and the enforcement, the violent enforcement of heteronormativity through this unveiling. Now in the film, Pierce did something incredible. She showed us this incredibly violent scene where Brandon's clothing is pulled off to reveal the female body, in much the same way that the male body was revealed in The Crying Game as the big reveal, right? The same reveal takes place in Boys Don't Cry, but Pierce gives her protagonist an out. So the camera splits, and we see another Brandon on the edge of the frame, looking, split from his own body, watching the scene of violent exposure. And it gives the transgender, on the one hand, it gives us an image of the transgender gaze as always doubled, right? You're in two places literally at the same time, but it also gives the trans person an out, an edge to go to, from which to escape the visual mayhem that's being inflicted upon the body, okay? So for me, it was a really, really important film for that, but unfortunately, it had another side effect, which was that it began a series of films within which the trans body is represented as a violated body. Now, if we go back to this body, Now you'll begin to see why I say it's unfortunate that we kind of didn't stick with the transgender body as the avenger, right? As the body that inflicts violence on the social order. Because at least the trans person there has agency and is the source of violence and is the inflictor of mayhem. By the time you get to Boys Don't Cry, the transgender person has become a victim par excellence. Okay? They are the most violated of all in the social order, and that representation of transgenderism persists today. And I want to come back to that in a bit at the end of the presentation, because I think that that has terrible consequences for thinking about transgender activism. Okay, the last film that I want to talk about from this period was a film that was, again, very subcultural. My guess is that people didn't see this film. Did anyone see By Hook or By Crook? Yeah, one. Because it circulated at LGBT festivals, film festivals. And it was a great film because it never explained the gender of the protagonists. So the two friends in the film are Harry Dodge and Silas Howard, who most queer audiences in the US would have recognized as queer, kind of lesbian figures at the time. Silas Howard was in a punk band called Tribe 8 that many people knew of, and Harry Dodge was a performance artist. They were also pictured in various drag king books and magazines, and they were subcultural heroes. So they made this film By Hook or By Crook in which they called each other he, and by their male names, Harry and Silas, but there was no explanation of who they were. Were they trans men? Were they men? Were they lesbians? They're embedded in a queer community, and we only saw them in relationship to other queer people. So it was a great film because it was as if the world were queer. And you never see any straight people, and you never are in spaces of heteronormativity. It's the whole world is queer. There's a fantastic dance scene in this legendary bar from the 1990s and 2000s in San Francisco called the Lexington Club. And it's a long montage sequence that goes on and on and on. It serves no purpose in the film. There's no narrative that's advanced by this scene. It's just a fantastic scene of joy and subcultural revelry. And in that scene, they are just queers among queers, right? So this is really different from these other two films where the trans person always appears in relationship to normative bodies as a wrong body. These bodies are not wrong, they are perfectly situated in their queer milieu. And that was the beauty of that film. Okay, so representing the transgender body is actually a very difficult thing to do. And I want to explain why, and then I want to give you some examples of how people have resolved the issue. So if you've seen some different ways that people have represented the transgender body. It's either as something pathetic. In the Brassai pictures, he sees those images of cross-dressed people in the 1930s in Paris. He sees them as sad and pathetic, somehow lost people. Or you, in the Brandon Tina case, or in the Crying Game case, you see the trans body, but you just see it as either male or female. Until it's exposed, you only see gender normativity. You don't see that the body is trans, right? So if the body is passing, then there's nothing to see. When you see that it's transgender, usually it's a moment of crisis. Okay? So representing transgenderism is actually very difficult. Because if somebody's passing, it seems like you're just representing maleness or femaleness. So this is the question. How do you actually represent transgenderism? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, how do you represent the mismatch between bodily identity and genitalia or morphology, right? So, in fact, there are abstract ways that people have represented the body that I think are much more compelling and interesting than these literalist ways. So the literalist ways are like this. You know, the transgender male body that is exposed as female, the transgender female body that is exposed as male. These are literal bodies that are revealed halfway through. But what about all of these other ways in which we represent the body in art, right? Eva Hesse, for example, took the body apart, and it wasn't the external pieces of the body that she imagined in her sculptures, it was the internal organs. It was as if the body had been turned inside out. It's a kind of Deleuzian representation of the body as a set of organs that come apart, a body without organs, a body that is only organs, right? So that would be one way of thinking about the abstract representation of transgenderism. Another way would be to go back to the 1960s and look at these incredible leather masks that Nancy Grossman made that people kind of didn't know what to do with when they came out. They seemed like they were sadomasochistic, or they were associated with the dungeons, or were they fascist, or were they about the obliteration of human identity? But because they deface the subject, we actually don't know what gender the head under the mask is. So this is also a representation of the illegibility and unreadability of human identity. And in that sense, is a very beautiful, these are beautiful sets of representations of the human coming undone, or the human that can't be captured by the gaze, if you like. And then finally, and then I'll move on in my last section to contemporary representations, something I call disaggregated embodiment. This is an artist from California who I've worked with a little bit, Linda Bessemer. And Linda Bessemer was somebody who made these sort of paint sculptures, and this, what looks like a tapestry, is made entirely out of paint. And Bessemer was somebody who was really sick of the ways in which we understood painting, for example, in a Jackson Pollock way, as the male artist spreading his seed onto the canvas, and the canvas representing the female body, right, the paint representing this sort of spermatic fluid. And that was how she was taught painting in art school. So she says, okay, if we have a gendered relationship between the canvas and the paint, I will get rid of the canvas, peel the paint off the canvas altogether, and represent the paint as a sort of dildo, if you like. It's a detachable thing that is phallic, but is not attached to any particular body. And I know it's a leap from this kind of sculpture, but it's how she literally thinks and writes about her work. And there are literally in her archive, she has sculptures of paint that are like, it looks like a brush stroke, a paint brush stroke, but there's no canvas, it's just affixed to the wall. Okay, so if you think about these brush strokes as, you know, literally detachable things, reminding us that the paintbrush is not the penis, the paintbrush is more like the dildo. It comes off the body, right? Then it sort of liberates painting itself from this masculinist activity. Okay, so I want to conclude. So I've given you this arc of representation of transgenderism, in which the transgender body is monstrous, pathetic, pathological, unthinkable, illegible, unrepresentable, violent, invisible, or spectacularly visible. And I want to go back to that Time magazine cover and say, okay, here we are at the tipping point. What's happened to all of those modes of representation as we enter an era within which transgenderism is suddenly quotidian? It's visible to everyday audiences. It isn't seen any longer as extraordinary, but it's something that is on Time magazine cover. When something is on Time magazine cover and is in the news and is casually referenced in Hollywood films, it isn't any longer marginal. So there are two things to reckon with here. One, the visual recognition of transgenderism, but two, the political recognition that transforms transgenderism from a site of potential resistance and transgression to a site of assimilation and accommodation. Can we any longer even make the claims about transgenderism that we used to make about it being a site of social justice, political violence, and so on? So here's another image of what's become of transgenderism in the contemporary mediascape. And in the US, I don't know if you watch this show in Switzerland, hopefully not, but if you don't now, it will come to you eventually. Caitlyn Jenner is basically an offshoot of the Kardashian machine, and even though she's being marketed as a kind of symbol for transgender liberation, she is actually a symbol for the neoliberal absorption of transgenderism into a mediascape that can accommodate all kinds of bodily difference without ever shifting or changing its, the relationship to thinking about the economy, or thinking about political representation, or thinking about the distribution of resources and wealth and so on, right? So nothing in the political order needs to change, but we get a symbol for how tolerant and how amazing we've become as a society, because we can look at Caitlyn Jenner and say, that's okay, I accept you, right? And this is literally how she is talked about in the American press. The show is banal beyond belief. She is a Republican, no doubt will vote for Donald Trump, suggested that gay marriage, she didn't believe in gay marriage because gay marriage violates her sense that marriage should be between a man and a woman. So remember what I was saying about contradiction? Here it is, political contradiction. She is only accepted because of the efforts of trans activists who have pushed back against Republican phobic, hateful discourse, but she will vote Republican and she will be against legal recognitions and legal equality and so on. Now, that said, she is also a product of the era within which gay marriage is seen as a liberatory project. And I would argue against gay marriage, but for different reasons than Caitlyn Jenner. She argues against gay marriage because marriage should be between a man and a woman. I would argue against gay marriage because gay marriage, like the phenomenon that produces Caitlyn Jenner, is an accommodationist discourse. Instead of it saying society must change to recognize all kinds of intimacy, it says queer people must change and be absorbed into the current social order. And therefore, it is the end of activism rather than its, achievement. And that's the era within which we have to situate the new visibility of the transgender body. So I want to conclude then with 3 examples of transgenderism that I think continue to push back on this social order that can be represented by Caitlyn Jenner. A new scene of a kind of political minoritarian set of beliefs that is still organized by the representation of the transgender body. And the first one is a project called Can to Be Destroyed by a British Jewish queer photographer, Sarah Davidman. And this project, which I'll explain to you in a moment, reminds us that the transgender body is not simply the body that was once male and is now female, or once female and is now male. The transgender body reminds us that all bodies are sites of process, right? And not in a progressive way necessarily. All bodies grow, shift, change, transform. At one stage of your life, you're able-bodied. At another stage of your life, you may even just break an ankle and experience your body as sort of broken in some way. Your desire may shift and change as your body changes. People come out in their midlife, right? Nothing about the body is stable. And that should be the work that the transgender body does. It should remind us about the instability of all flesh, not of the extraordinary restabilization of the transgender body through sex reassignment surgery. So just briefly, that's the argument here. This piece comes from a legacy. It was an inheritance that Sarah Davidman got when her mother died. Her mother died and she left her papers to her daughter. And in her papers, she found this literal manila envelope upon which was written, Can to be destroyed. The pictures were of her uncle, Ken, who'd been married to her mother's sister. And Ken, in the middle of his life, had realized a desire to dress and live as a woman part-time. Okay? He didn't live as a woman his whole life, and this is just a photograph from the project that Sarah Davidman made out of the photographs and the papers that her mother left to her. Okay? So in this manila envelope, and it's so poignant, right, that on the cover it says Can to be destroyed. So this is a life lived under the sign of destruction, right? And she decides not to destroy the photographs, but she does alter them. So she changes them in terms of their meaning and in terms of their structure. This one is a wedding photograph that the wedding photographer had sent back to the couple with the word proof scrawled over the image. And Davidman suggests that this word is deeply ambiguous in relationship to the ambiguous life of Ken, who also went by Kay when she was dressing as a woman. So what is the wedding picture proof of? Kay's heterosexuality? Kay's male identity? Kay's female identity? What is the photograph ever proof of? The word there makes us ask. This is an image that Sarah added to the project of her own family, in which she has cut out the image of her own sister. Because when she decided to make a photographic project out of the images contained in the envelope, Ken to be destroyed, her sister said, no, you mustn't do this, and I want nothing to do with the project. You will make the family a laughingstock. This is, you know, an awful thing to do to our uncle's memory. So she cut her sister out of the frame altogether, which is incredibly violent, but again reminds us of the instability of the family as a whole. Right? In an earlier moment, we would have said that the instability of the family is the transgender character, who cannot be the father, cannot be the husband, cannot be the man. But now, in Sarah Davidman's work, the family itself is a set of shifting identities within which roles are constantly shifting and changing. And the transgender person is just one side of instability and change. She also painted photographs of her uncle so that he can appear in the photographs as Kay as well as Ken. Okay? So she hand paints the photographs to try to give her uncle, her aunt, some of the femininity that he so desired. But at the same time, she recognizes that his desire to be trans inflicts violence on the aunt who is married to him. Because what is her marriage to this person who she thought was a man, who also lives as a female, right? So we see the way in which the whole family is turned upside down by this kind of information. There's an image of the happy couple with proof. There you see the proof scrolled across it. And here's the image remade by Sarah Davidman. And it's I think it's actually very beautiful because it suggests that it's not simply that they are a couple, but that their identities are produced through something we could call in English adjacency. Their side-by-sideness asks us to read them as male, female, as a couple, as heterosexual, as gay. What are they in this image? Are they lesbians? Are they heterosexual? Are they man and woman, man and wife and wife? We actually don't even know how to read this, right? So this project reminds us of the instability of all bodies, particularly within the family matrix. Second, and more quickly, have people seen this TV series in Switzerland, The Transparent? Transparent takes up that same theme, sees the family not simply as something that is disrupted by the patriarch coming out as transgender, but everyone in the family is fucked up in some way, right? That's the point about the whole show. The sister tries being a lesbian and then goes back to her husband. They are all promiscuous. The brother marries a rabbi and then decides against it. So everyone is playing out a set of conflictual, contradictory, internally conflicted desires, and the family, one family, no apologies. The family is seen as a space that just barely holds all of these people together in place. Finally, at the end of the second season, spoiler alert, there's this incredible scene where Moira has been to a women's music festival with her sometimes lesbian daughters, right? Finds out when she gets to the women's music festival that it's for women born women only, and she is therefore unwelcome. She leaves the land and is picked up on the way out by Angelica Houston's character, who's bisexual. They go to a motel and they have sex. But again, it's the most complicated sex scene probably in all of media, because Moira is a trans woman who has not had sex reassignment surgeries. The Angelica Houston character is a bisexual woman who is sleeping with someone who is a trans woman and still has a penis, right? And so the sex scene is one of awkwardness, nothing fits, it's an intimacy that maybe we haven't seen before, and all of the weirdness of it is not located simply on the trans body. It's the entire encounter that is unreadable. And I think that that's just a beautiful sort of metaphor for what the show is able to bring out. And then the name of the show, Transparent, couldn't be further from the truth. Nothing is transparent in the show. Everything we have to question. So I want to conclude then with to relate a little bit to the conference and the festival that you have here in terms of dance. I want to conclude with a piece of dance that I think brings together the contradiction of the trans body with a form of movement that completely shatters and remakes the way that we think about drag, right? So drag, we have a long tradition of men dressing up as women, women dressing up as men, a lip-synced performance that is camp, that is supposed to be funny, humorous, sad, pathetic, interesting, arch, whatever it may be. This next performer, boychild, has anyone ever seen boychild perform? A few people, yeah. Stunning.
I've been here.
And he has been here, of course. So they are an ambiguously gendered performer who used to be a model for Hood by Air, the designer label. They also are an artist who has created all kinds of images. This was a show that they created for a Cindy Sherman show, where every artist was asked to recreate a Cindy Sherman piece. So they took a kind of female piece and recreated it in a way that you can't tell whether this is a male person performing in drag or a female person performing in female drag, and so on. But in their dance performances, they are much likely to connect to a Japanese dance form, Buto. Right? And Buto, you'll remember, was the dance of death, was an art form that was generated by the post-nuclear generations in Japan to call attention to the slow death of the generations that came after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these really grotesque movements, winding movements within which the beauty of the dance was shattered by a body that is sort of being unmade, is taken up by boychild in these very queer performances. And I want to play one for you. It was taped very early on in their career in a nightclub in San Francisco. They are performing to Rihanna's song Rude Boy, but Rude Boy has been taken down an octave, so it sounds like a male voice. It's looped, so we only hear the chorus. And it's transformed from a heterosexual anthem, where Rihanna is singing to a rude boy that he should make a move on her, to a kind of weird queer anthem about love. And in the middle of that, boychild is performing this Buto-esque dance of death, dispossession, love, and queer gendered embodiment. And so I'll play it for you, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. Without the lights.
We're going to take the lights.
performance. It doesn't look to me like any kind of drag that I've seen before. It seems as if we're watching a female body, and yet the musculature and the movement and their gender presentation everywhere else suggests that this is a gender ambiguous body. The light sticks in the mouth make the body seem otherworldly and seem as if they are sort of, you know, the source of some extraterrestrial message that's passing through them. They're also taking polish and moving it around on the body, which I think refers to a kind of an understanding of blackness as not of the fact of the body, but as Fanon will put it, but a kind of mobile relationship to blackness. And finally, for me, the whole performance and these other texts that I've spoken of suggest that we have to move beyond an identity politics, the kind that has been taken up by Time magazine and Caitlyn Jenner. It's not enough to say, I am Kate. It's not enough to be transgender and think that that is the announcement of a politics. We have to move towards a politics that isn't just about practice, but is about mobility, movement, as is the theme of this festival, dynamism, love, transition, transformation, this sort of spectacular and dynamic relationship to a political force field, not the singular, exceptional, individualized relationship that we have used in the past. So I hope we can use these new articulations of transgenderism, not simply to think about transgenderism, but to think about social justice and politics writ large. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. We'll go to some Q&A. I'm sure that you have lots of questions, and if you don't, I have something that can start us off. But I know that the Zurich audience is in such a vibrant, dynamic mode after that talk, so please, by all means, ask your questions. Zurich moves. I might ask one then, Jack, if I may. I was very interested in your kind of micro-genealogy that you offered as a transgender body, and I found it significant that you started in the 1960s, because obviously one very famous film that comes to mind with regard to issues of transgender and under the Hays Code is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Yeah. And I'm wondering to what extent in this kind of genealogical approach one could look at Hitchcock's Psycho and the idea constructed around the film as well in relation to this idea of secrecy, because what was so interesting about Hitchcock's idea when he was promoting Psycho is that he also told the audience, and there were cardboard effigies of him in front of cinemas, to not tell what they had seen in the film. Right. So that same kind of marketing device was used to promote, not promote Psycho around the secret that the transgender drag body was, and then we see that with
the Crying
Game.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you think about kind of the idea of secrecy and how maybe drag and transgenderism co-evolve, especially in an age when we have RuPaul's Drag Race, which commodifies the drag body and allows for it to subvert or to act. So I'm wondering if you could maybe think about those two things.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, Dress to Kill is very much of that trajectory, where, you know, Psycho is obviously the most famous in the genre of films that tell us that where a body is internally conflicted around its gender, or more particularly, where a man is too cathected onto his mother, right? This is the secret at the heart of Psycho. Violence ensues. And this is played out again in that beautiful little film, Ma Vie en Rose, by the French film about the little boy Ludo, who identifies as a girl and has it came out in the 90s as well, I think. It's quite an old film, this beautiful little film. And he identifies as a girl and is completely unfettered and unworried about his relationship to girlhood. But the father has, you know, the whole family has to play its role in enforcing normativity on his little queer body. And the final decision is that he's been over-influenced by the mother. So this theme that transgenderism is a problem because of the mother reminds us that there's a sexism at the very heart of our transphobia. Transphobia, particularly against the trans female body, has a sexist origin to it. And that's, of course, that's all of Hitchcock's films are this sort of spectacular template of the sexist heart of the societies that they were about. So I think that what I'm trying to get at is the joined status of sexism and transgenderism, and then the way in which these later films try hard to correct this, both by through a feminist project as much as through a transphilic project, if you like. But yeah, I mean, it's hard not to go back to Psycho and just, it's such a simple template, and it's so appealing, right, to say when someone is internally contradictory, feels contradictory, they will be the source of violence. That's just actually not how serial killing works. As we know, serial killers are always these hyper-normative men, white men, who want to correct the society that they live in, and they often are rule keepers and law abiders. They are the people who are more bound to the law than anyone. So that cultural fantasy that the person who looks different is also the monster is just that, it's a fantasy. The real site of violence is the place of hypernormativity.
Great, any questions? Guys, okay.
Well, how do you think, how is transgenderism being represented in Switzerland or in Europe? I mean, is this, you know, this is a very American take because America has become the site of, you know, of course Americans want to say, we're so tolerant, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you could think about Conchita Wurst and the impact that had winning, you know, the Eurovision, this male body in female dress and lip syncing, etc., and all that kind of drag culture, and then the beard.
Right.
So maybe do people want to react on their perception of the drag / transgender body in Europe? That'd be interesting.
Yeah. But then it's also again this kind of phenomenon that you commercialize this.
Yeah.
So it's different phases of this.
And it's again this contradiction of glorifying this figure in order to like give a representation for the purpose of like the country, the government, or whatever, and at the same time, many people in the society still not accepting that body. So,
or just like a kind of still extravagant, like a thing.
Excessive. Yeah.
Within the very camp register of the Eurovision itself, right? It is that kind of freak show event, and it does play into that pathologizing or extravagant figure, I guess. Mona?
I would really jump on that. I think either it's like these really commercial kind of representations. Okay, yeah. I would jump on what you just said. I think either we have those body in this kind of commercial frame, as Conchita Wurst, kind of self-marketing, or we have it framed like somewhere as a drag performance in a club or somewhere, but you rarely see transgender people in daily lives. So I think they are still quite invisible, because you have also been talking about this kind of visibility and how the kind of representation changed. Of course, we see Caitlyn Jenner on this magazine, but it's not what transgender is in daily life as a practice. And I think there the activism should start somehow.
Right. And but also that rather than the measure of some kind of change being whether we see trans people, but I take your point, we also want to think about how the impact of transgenderism shifts the coordinates of gender and sexuality for everyone. And that's the point that I'm always trying to make, and that I made in Gaga Feminism, is like, in a post-transgender age, male, female, I mean, this is a point that Beatriz Preciado makes in their work, Paul Preciado makes, that male and female and heterosexual, homosexual, these are nonsense categories in an era of enhanced reproductive technologies. What is heterosexuality when the man has Viagra, the woman is taking hormones to enhance her reproductive capability, lesbians are getting sperm from a sperm bank, gay men are paying a surrogate to carry their child? What is the meaning? I mean, this is something that Preciado asked that I think is absolutely right. They argue, Paul argues that identity is being rewritten, not on the surface of the body, but at the level of what they call the molecular, that we are all embedded in this pharmacopornographic regime, where the things that we take, the pills we ingest, the pharmaceuticals that flow through the culture, shift and change the body from within. And the external is what we keep focusing on, when in fact the real transformation is elsewhere. And it is such an important argument, and yet it's very hard to take up in practical terms when we try to think about activism. And so in activism, people still go with these very rude categories of gay, straight, trans, you know. So I think we have to actually reimagine the political. It has to be a different kind of space where we're asking for something else. Yeah.
Marcus?
I have a question.
You keep on imposing this on us, so there you go.
I have a question. Is there any history of emancipation of people who said there is a whole field of emancipation from people, and not only from trans people, also people who have mental disabilities? Is there a history of a connection? They say.
Right.
Yeah, because it's, I think for disabled people, it's really hard because a lot of those people, they cannot do it by themselves. They need someone. So they are in a very hard position to make their own emancipation. And I think this kind of emancipation didn't start even now. We are.
Yeah, no, totally. And there's a great essay that I read recently, I think it's maybe in social text, somewhere like that, by Jasbir Poir, on what she calls both transgender exceptionalism and the exceptionalism around the disabled body. And on the one hand, she is making the argument that you're making, which is that could we connect somehow the activism around these otherwise gendered bodies that are gendered in unconventional ways, and bodies that are able in different ways, you know, not simply disabled, but differently abled. Could we connect these projects? It's a really good question, but she first says we have to push back on the idea that there's something exceptional about the trans body, or something exceptional about the disabled body, because it keeps rendering the coordinates of normativity the same, right? So if you say, well, yes, the disabled body is the most visible body that disrupts the norm. Well, but then we still have all of this fantasy around what an able-bodied person is, and as disability discourse reminds us, most of us are only temporarily able-bodied, you know. The lifespan is such that you will move through disability in your life. You know, and rather than making a distinction between people who are born that way and people who become that way, which we don't make that distinction in relationship to queerness, for example, despite Lady Gaga, we don't want to make the argument that queer people are born that way. We see that people become queer. We also see that people have very, very wild and eccentric relationships to ability. And some of these abilities and disabilities are mental, some are physical, some are temporary, some are permanent. But both discourses, transgenderism and disability discourse, are pushing back on the idea that there even is such a thing as a normative body. And so you don't want to keep producing these exceptional bodies that need to be accepted. What we want to do is keep attacking the site of normativity and challenging its legitimacy. So I think that that's where I would go with that. Yeah.
And do you think movement or a dance, and like a body practice is a good way to kind of spread and make this idea of the body as some process of becoming and never really stabilize, like unit, would be a good tool to go. Because I also struggle a lot like this, whether you want to kind of represent and do is ending up with this categorizing, and from my experience also as a dancer, I feel like it's really coming through very good with this idea of like open and transitional thing, you know?
Yeah, especially dance where we're not so focused upon the excellence of the dancing body, but the body as an unconventional body that moves in a certain way, that doesn't just, reproduce beautiful balletic moves and so on. And in my Wild book, I actually have a chapter on Rite of Spring, precisely for the brokenness of the forms that it pioneers, whatever we may think about Rite of Spring now and whatever happened to it in terms of becoming a canonical text, we are still shocked when we try to reimagine the ballet, by the pigeon-toed, awkward, broken, ugly kinds of movements that literally destroyed the bodies of the dancers, which is partly why it was not performed very often, because the jumping was, I saw a recreated performance of it a few years ago, which, is all it's all a fantasy because we can't really recreate it, but the jumping, one of the dancers said that you actually cannot dance that ballet without really just collapsing at the end. There's too much jumping and there's too much movement, and so the body breaks down about halfway through, and so the brokenness of the form is actually enhanced by the process within which you become exhausted. And I think, what's the name of the woman who recreated it? The German dancer, Pina Bausch, right? She really brought out in her version the sweat and the absolute exertion to the point of collapse that the ballet brings about. And that's exactly where I want to go with this, that we have to think about identity and its limits in terms of what the body can and cannot do, not just in terms of these 19th century ideas of morphology or shape. What is the shape of the body? What is the shape of the genitalia? That actually, it doesn't really matter. Like, your genitalia are hardly the way in which your gender or your bodily identity signifies. So I agree with you that dance, choreography, that kind of language gives us a much better way of thinking about bodily identity in this era.
And also practicing dance, not only watching, because I feel like how to influence, because of course all of this is in the case of the viewer also many times, know how to categorize it. Even though I mean it very different.
Yeah.
So I think in practice of dance you can somehow influence how people look at things.
Yes. It's fantastic.
Any other questions? I might just jump in actually
what
you just said, because I'm interested in the boychild performance that we saw in relation to photography actually, because some of you may know Jack has collaborated with Del Grey's Volcano on a magnificent book called The Drag King.
I did, yeah, a long time ago.
A long time ago, and it's one of my favorite works that you've done because of the use of photography and the way you play with the medium that is so devoted from the 19th century onward to fixing what it means to be human, right? Criminal photography in the 19th century meticulously registers every aspect of the body and categorizes it to make a new science. And you're using that medium, which is so charged with this kind of scientific content, to subvert the idea of heteronormativity furthermore. So I'm wondering if you talk about the use of photography in relation to other other art forms such as dance, and maybe think about fixity versus mobility.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something quickly. When I was showing the Versailles pictures, my point there, for example, and Del Grey's Volcano remade some of those Versailles pictures, is that what Versailles thinks he's seen and what we see from a distance, across many, many years, as something different. Versailles, when he gave captions to those pictures, he was like, oh, these sad, pathetic people in the bar. But what we see are people who seem like they're having a pretty good time, and hey, by the way, there's a lesbian bar in Paris in the 1930s. In fact, there were many. and now in London and New York there are none. So you actually are seeing these images that are super interesting in terms of these very, very vibrant subcultures. And I think that Dell's project was to precisely make this utopic world out of the imagery that other people had used to represent a kind of dystopian, disturbed universe. He took the same images and he, took such joy in taking pictures of genderqueer bodies that I think that pleasure comes through. And there's something of that in some of boychild's performances.
Yes, I was particularly interested in the use of the flash lighting, because it reminded me of photography, the flash, but it was animated, right? So it continued to happen, continued to become, and then the light coming through his mouth, kind of as if that flash was being thrown back at you, right? It's kind of pulsating. So I was wondering about the ways in which queerness and flow can coalesce to make the body become.
But I think it's more there, if we were to make the connection to photography, it's more also about light. Because obviously the photographic flash is something that illuminates the face or the body so that the camera can see it. But in the case of boychild, the flash seems to come from within. So it's the source of the flash rather than the object. And I think that that's what makes boychild's performance I remember the first time I saw it, I just thought it was so uncanny and unreadable and odd. And now I've seen, lots of people use the flash, and it's used in fashion shows, and Rick Owens' show, all the models have these light sticks in their mouth, at which point you're like, whatever, not interesting anymore, But when I saw boychild do it in a nightclub in San Francisco, you really felt as if he was remaking drag, completely, in terms of its meaning, its performance, its gestures, and everything.
Thank you. We have time for at least one or two more questions. Stab you with my mic. If not, I suggest that we thank Jack warmly.
Thank you.